Welcome to the Free Court Show with your host, Jason Hartman. No, Jason's not a lawyer. He's just a regular businessman, a regular consumer. The legal system is broken and most people cannot access it. Jason and his powerful guests are here to help level the playing field so that you, the consumer, can better understand your rights, have options and recourse, and listen to the experts explore new products and services so that you can be an empowered citizen in the system. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome Joseph Tartakovsky. He's the former Deputy Solicitor General of Nevada, a James Wilson Fellow in Constitutional Law at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. He's author of the new book, The Lives of the Constitution, 10 Exceptional Minds That Shaped America's Supreme Law. Joseph, welcome. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yeah, it's good to have you. The Constitution, obviously one of the most important documents, I believe, in world history, not just for people in the U.S., but in the entire world, because it set an example for the world of how government should be restrained, and individual rights are very, very important. So it's an incredible document. Many say written with abstract flexibility, fascinating look. And now you've looked at 10 big thinkers throughout history and kind of profiled what they thought about the Constitution and how that impacted the document through time, right?
That's right. The story of the American people under the Constitution is an epic one. We've entered our third century under this 18th century document. And so the only way I could even begin to approach it was to pick people who said or did extraordinary things that teach us something about our Constitution. Some of them as judges, some of them as journalists. I even have two foreigners who came to this country to study our institutions. And the purpose was to show how much has changed and how much has remained the same, but above all, how we've pulled it off, how we have become the people who have lived under a written charter longer than any other on earth.
It is the longest written charter. I mean, there are countries older than the United States. Has it just been that their charters have been changed and ours has only been amended? What do you mean by that?
Take France, a much older country in most senses of the word, but since the time our Constitution took effect, in 1788, they've had 5 republics, 2 Napoleonic empires, a few monarchies, a Vichy regime. Their government has fallen and been recreated under different forms of government multiple times. Ours hasn't. The average length of a national constitution since ours took effect is something like 19 years, and we've done 230. So there's a certain durability that we have that no nation has even approached.
Okay, so is it the document? Is it that brilliant of a document? Is it the way it was written, or is it the country to which it applies? What has given it such longevity?
So that you'd have to have the document, and the institutional arrangements are as well crafted as I think any other constitution in history, but it can't only be that. There's something more. I think it's something that I call our constitutional culture, a set of assumptions and temperaments and habits and traditions that are just as important as the text itself. And we know this because other countries have constitutions that look quite a bit like ours. Most of them start with "we the people of Mongolia" or "we the people of Tunisia." And many of them have things that we consider mainstays of our constitutional order, like protections for speech or the press. But those paper guarantees are actually quite meaningless in practice in many countries. I was living in Russia when the state took over the last independent TV station in the country. And the Russians, to my shock, just shrugged. But the reason was that they've never had a free press. They've never had a free speech respected in the real world. And so their constitution, which purports to protect these things, is in practice absolutely hollow because you don't have government officials to honor it, and you don't have a population that rises in outrage when it is dishonored.
Right. Okay. All right. So very interesting. So take us through some of these 10 minds. Maybe you want to, in the interest of time, maybe you want to pick 3 of them that are diverse. Like you said, you've got journalist, a foreigner. Tell us about maybe 3 of them and kind of their thoughts about the Constitution, their impact on it or with it. I'm not sure how to say that, but you take the lead.
Sure. So take Alexander Hamilton, who even with the Broadway musical, I think still hasn't gotten his due. Hamilton's interesting because you can divide our entire constitutional history into the Hamilton tendency and the Jefferson tendency. Hamilton was the believer in broad, flexible, powerful readings of the Constitution. The Constitution allowed almost everything. Jefferson represents the view that the Constitution is a creature of restriction. These two tendencies have always contended in our history and prevailed to various extents. By today, however, I think we live under a Hamiltonian Constitution. Take a State of the Union speech. You have a president get up of either party, talk about how far-flung our military is, how robust our international trade is, how carefully he's exercising stewardship over the economy. These were all the things that Hamilton dreamed of. And these were the things that gave Jefferson nightmares, or he thought unconstitutional. I mean, standing armies and federal control over the economy. So we fully realized Hamilton's vision, and we quote Jefferson, but we don't follow him. So Hamilton's an interesting guy in seeing two things. One, how much we've come to fulfill the hopes of the founders, but also how.
But in a Hamiltonian, not a Jeffersonian way, right?
Exactly. And that's the other thing, is that when we talk about the founding fathers, sentences begin, the founding fathers thought this or that.
Right.
I've come to believe that there were no such people as the founding fathers, not in the sense of a sort of band of brothers with a coherent body of thought. They all agreed with everything. They just sort of united to set us on our constitutional course. They fought over every provision of the Constitution in drafting it. They fought over ratification, and it almost wasn't ratified. And they fought over its concrete application once the Constitution took effect. What I find, and this is what I think is so interesting about our constitutional history, is that often our decisions are a belated agreement with one founder over another, as opposed to some sort of departure from the founders or betrayal, as sometimes people like to suggest.
Let me ask you this to understand. Are you, I guess, personally in favor of the way it has evolved to a Hamiltonian way? I mean, just because that's the way it all went doesn't mean that's what everybody likes. Well, I guess the politicians at least like it. The lawmakers at least like it, right? Or the Supreme Court does too, in addition to Congress, because that's the way it's gone.
It's a large question. It's hard to say, in the sense that it seems to me that the broad, flexible reading of the Constitution has been a large part of our wealth and our strength and our power, which Americans seem to like. I mean, everyone takes credit. Everyone's glad that America is such a muscular, industrialized country. If Jefferson had his way, would we have reached that? I don't know. It's partly not a choice at all, in the sense that the Commerce Clause, which has been one of the engines of federal growth, it meant something different in a time when most people lived in villages they never left, and villages that were essentially self-sufficient, than it does in an age of international commerce.
Yeah, and just domestic commerce across state lines. I mean, it's amazing. I just look at my own businesses and how I deal with so many people that are nationwide, and it's really kind of annoying that we've got these different state jurisdictions. As much as I'm in favor, at least philosophically, of states' rights and local governance versus big federal governance, it makes things a lot more complicated. Like, for example, when something goes wrong, where do you settle your dispute? In which jurisdiction? Licensure. How do you hire a professional that is only limited to practicing in one state? It makes things complicated.
It does, and one of the results has been not just the federal government choosing to expand itself into these new areas, but demands by people, including state governments, expressing the will of the people to have more federal intervention as we become interlinked. So, for instance, just to give one sort of example, you could pick them almost at random. There's a federal law that prevents unfair debt collection practices, calling someone like in the middle of the night during their dinner, hounding them.
Yeah, they do it anyway, but
this was a law passed in the 70s.
Right.
And I remember learning about the law and finding that the states had essentially demanded it, because if you live in, say, Arizona and you're getting a call from Nevada, it's very hard for state authorities to reach that unscrupulous caller.
Right.
But the federal government can, and so on with all sorts of problems.
Sure.
Take the opioid crisis. When Teddy Roosevelt signed the Federal Food and Drug Act, this idea that the federal government would protect us from unsafe substances, that was very controversial. But when President Trump says, I'm going to tackle the opioid crisis, everyone says, quite right. You're the one that's supposed to be doing it, because the federal government is much more effective at preventing the flow of drugs, some of them across the border. But even if it was an entirely domestic problem, just between state lines, there's these coordination problems that arise if it's just states. And that was something that actually, in a way, was something that Jefferson said. He said something like, in all cases where the states can do it themselves, they should. And in all cases where they're not able to do it themselves, the federal government. And in that time, that kind of meant something like the federal government would manage the coastline and would deal with war and peace and diplomacy. But with the growth and interlinkages in expanding commerce, that actually became much more of a domestic power.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So Alexis de Tocqueville is commonly quoted, and by the way, there are some fantastic quotes. And I believe you think de Tocqueville misunderstood America. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, Tocqueville is very interesting because here's a guy that came here in his 30s with halting English, spent 271 days in the country, and then writes a book that many people consider the best book ever written on America. It's an extraordinary achievement. I find that part of that achievement is a product of his brilliant writing. He wrote things that seem to express eternal truth, so he's eminently quotable. What people miss, though, is, and Tocqueville said this himself, not so much in the book, but in letters to friends and elsewhere, he came to show what democracy had in store for France, both what France had to hope from it and fear from it. He wasn't a big fan of much of American life. And so he did miss important things that I think a fellow named James Bryce, who came 40 years later from England, captured. And Bryce, for a time, was a rival with Tocqueville as the author of the best book in America. Tocqueville since eclipsed him. But for example, Tocqueville wasn't interested in what we think of these very basic emblems of early America: railroads, banking, manufacturing. He thought capitalism was sort of a low thing that distracted from high flights of soul, whereas actually most of us think capitalism in this country is sort of the economic expression of our political liberties.
Well, if he wasn't so crazy about capitalism, what system did he like? I mean, compared to what?
He seemed to be okay with the idea of you'd have like a class of aristocrats that would be in charge of writing great books and producing great art, not having to work for a living. He seemed to be he was comfortable with aristocracy to a degree that we're not. His political views seemed to be something more like a managed democracy, where you have sort of certain popular control, but there's a sort of aristocratic class that keeps the balance. He seems to have been okay with the idea of a constitutional king. It was only very late in life that he came around to full suffrage, because he did not think that, isn't this wonderful, every person gets to vote. He was very much of the more old-fashioned view that you saw among certain of the founders, this idea that popular rule meant mob rule. I mean, the idea that you let every person vote as opposed to the property classes, the people that supposedly had a stake in society, was very scary to some people. And in fact, it took this country some time to get around to full suffrage for men.
Yeah.
And he also wasn't very interested in our institutional arrangements, Constitution. So, for example, both he and Bryce looked at why did it seem that senators were more prestigious than representatives. And Tocqueville said, well, it must be because senators are themselves chosen by the state representatives. This is a time before direct election, whereas Bryce was more likely to pull out his copy of the Constitution and notice that, for instance, senators have vast advice and consent powers over foreign affairs. They serve longer terms. That's why it's better to be a senator.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay, what else do you want us to know? I mean, we got sort of sidetracked here. I'd still like to get those three thinkers down, at least in a nutshell. At least 3 of your 10. Do you want to talk about, maybe another one?
Sure. Why don't we talk about Woodrow Wilson?
Sure.
I picked him as a sort of, he's become an anti-hero.
Okay. I don't know much about him, so tell me.
He has no natural constituency. He was pretty bad on race, one of the worst in modern American history as a president. Wouldn't talk to black audiences, allow the resegregation of federal government. But he's also hated on the right for things like supposedly introducing the administrative state or the lack of the separation of powers. I found Woodrow Wilson interesting because this is a guy who for 25 years was a professional scholar of the Constitution before he took office, which he did in 1910, and by 1912 he was president. So he was sort of a non-politician for most of his life. And he wrote very interesting things. So for instance, he criticizes violating the separation of powers, blending the executive and legislative branches. We always have to put these things in perspective. When Woodrow Wilson was president, this was at an age when it was seen as unconstitutional for the president to visit the Congress in person. Mm-hmm. Jefferson had begun this tradition of never visiting Congress. He thought that's what kings did. This was a monarchical thing. Mm-hmm. Woodrow Wilson visited Congress to give a speech in 1913. He was the first president to do so in about 110 years. And his argument was it was good enough for George Washington. It was good enough for John Adams. This was an age when the Speaker of the House was probably as powerful as the president. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see how these things have shifted over time. Now today, the president, I think one of the common criticisms is that the president sort of dominates Congress. So before, the criticism was that the Congress was too powerful and the president sort of an errand boy for the legislature. But now, people were worried that Congress is sort of doing the bidding of the president instead of acting as an independent body of government. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's always a struggle, in other words, to keep the separation of powers, to strike the right balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. Good stuff. Give out your website and tell people where they can find the book.
So I have a website, Joseph Tartakovsky. It's Tartakov, and Victor, SKY.com. I have some more about the book there, some of my other writings. And the book is in stores. If they don't have it at your store, you can always ask for it, and it's online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
All the usual places.
So I invite everyone, all the usual, find bookstores everywhere.
Excellent. Joseph, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jason. Pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you for listening to The Free Court Show. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or the platform of your choice. You can find the show notes and resources for today's episode at freecourt.com. Remember that guests' opinions are their own and information is of general nature, so be sure to consult appropriate tax, legal, and other professionals for specific advice.